In the previous lesson, we looked at the theory behind Ken Wilber's 4 quadrants model, and that was all focused on explanation, and this lesson is focused on application. What we're asking is, how do I actually use these 4 quadrants to improve the quality of my life? So in this lesson, we're going to apply it to 3 different categories. Firstly, problems and issues that we might face. Second, values and characteristics that we might like to embody. And third, bigger life questions and how to go about tackling them. Again, all based on this. And I closed that previous lesson by saying we need to think about not just whether we agree or disagree with another person's answer, but instead think about what type of question that they're trying to answer in the first place. So it only makes sense to try to turn this inwards and see what questions that we're trying to answer and problems that we're trying to solve in our own lives first. So with that in mind, let's have a look at very common problems that we all face, and I'm going to start with anxiety. So, rather than just do a full summary of the model again, just in general, I'm going to do a more specific recap and just show how I might consider an issue like this. So, when we consider anxiety, there is the subjective aspect of anxiety. That is the I that experiences it internally. So, in the upper left quadrant, the interior individual aspect, we might ask a question like, what thoughts am I having that are making me feel anxious? Or what is my self-talk like at this moment in time? But we could also analyze the objective aspect of our anxiety, which is the it. That's the upper right quadrant, the exterior individual aspect. So we could look more at our bodies for something like this. So rather than going inwards and interpreting our mind, we're looking at our bodies instead. So now that I'm feeling anxious, what are the physical symptoms of this anxiety? These are things that you can check. So it could include things like your heart rate, considering what you've just eaten, how much sleep you've had building up to this moment, and so on, things like that. So you can think of all this as data that you could track. But what about the collective aspects? How do they fit in with something like anxiety? Well, in the lower left quadrant, we have the interior aspects of the collective, which could mean family just as it means culture more widely. So think about how you might use the word we in various contexts, and that'll help you to point towards this particular section. So we might ask something like here, what are the beliefs that I've inherited about anxiety? How do my parents view anxiety? What about the culture where I grew up and my friendships and the other authority figures? How do they view anxiety? This can be quite an illuminating section because you might realize that the thoughts that you've had about a particular issue, they're not even yours to begin with, but they're instead just the patterns or the language or the phrases that you've heard from someone else that you've just unknowingly and unconsciously taken on for yourself. So just to stick with this area for a second, as a little example, you might not be able to see your anxiety for what it is because the family judgment of anxiety means weakness occurs automatically because that's what your dad believed growing up, just as an example. In that case, there might be an expectation to suppress it in your family, but you might have a friend who feels safe enough to discuss anxiety openly. There's no right or wrong. There's only seeing what is normal for different people given their lives up until this point and what groups that they've been a part of. That's very much this section here, which is why it's good to consider what you mean when we say we. And then finally, in the lower right quadrant, we've got the exterior collective. And it could be useful to ask something like, what are the structures that are in place around me that cause me to feel anxious or to keep it going? So this might be your work-life balance or the work environment itself. It might be wider financial pressures. It could be your home life. It could be the living conditions, the technology that you use, the governmental policies on a wider scale that are in place at the minute. And it could even be like further reaching ecological and future concerns if you really wanted to extend this section. Personally, I just simplify this down to immediate structures and environments, just to keep this practical and to keep me from over-analysing everything. So what is impacting me in the immediate environment? And just notice for a second with all this, how much of a fuller picture this is of your anxiety when you consider all 4 of these quadrants together. It's not just my inner experience of anxiety. It's not just what my body's doing when I'm anxious. It's not just how my family view the word anxiety. And it's not just the environments around me that are keeping me in this anxious state. It's all of them combined together. So rather than driving yourself absolutely crazy by, for example, meditating and introspecting all day and getting nowhere, that might be the upper left, you might try tracking your diet and your sleep schedule and seeing what happens, which will be in the upper right. Or maybe, throughout all of this, it might prompt a good and meaningful discussion with your family so you can start to understand how you came to view anxiety in this way in the first place. Or it might prompt a consideration of your work environment. They're all just hypothetical examples, but they all point to the same thing, which is that we're looking for a multi-perspective analysis of this issue to do it justice. So just think about how you might apply something like this to burnout or jealousy or shame or whatever else it might be that you are facing at this point in time. But on top of all this, maybe it's not actually a problem that you're trying to analyse, but maybe it's something more positive. Maybe you're looking for new values to explore, so different attributes and traits and characteristics that you'd like to develop and to start embodying within yourself. In that case, we'd follow exactly the same procedure. And a big part of integral theory, which Ken Wilber writes out extensively across all of his books, is acting with intention and integrity. So with that in mind, let's run integrity through the quadrants. Now, I've prepared quite a lot of questions here, so I can show you some examples of exactly how you would navigate each of these areas. I'm going to fly through them fairly quickly. So, with all of this in mind, we've got this top corner again, interior individual. How does integrity feel to me internally? So if we're going to ask specific questions to reflect on, I might ask, do I feel truly aligned with my actions? Or what emotions do I experience when I compromise on my values and act inauthentically? Or where in my life am I not being fully honest with myself right now? These would all be interior individual. Exterior individual. This might be things like, what has happened in my body when I act against my values? Or where do I feel the tension or the stress in my body when I act without integrity? And if I look at my habits and my behaviours, to what extent am I embodying integrity currently? I know the 7 minutes into this video, you probably get the picture by now. Just for completion's sake, I'm going to do the last two quadrants as well before we move on to the last little section. So on the interior collective down here, that might be the wider question around what does integrity mean in my community or to my culture? So again, a couple of questions. What are the assumptions, both positive and negative, that come along with the word integrity? And how is this value praised or shamed for being displayed? And what are the limits to it as well? And when I think of the word integrity, who do I immediately picture? Who has been a particularly good example of this value? And then finally, just over here, bottom corner, exterior collective. So what we're asking here is, how do the wider systems that I'm a part of reward or punish integrity? So again, last three questions. How is integrity forced onto me from the wider society and in the workplace as a value that I should embody, whether I like it or not? And what are the systems and the groups that I'm a part of that I support, even though they don't act with integrity? And also, what would I be willing to change in my immediate environment that might help me embody integrity more easily? So, like I say, I've pre-prepared all those questions because there's no way I could come up with all these and just rally them off the top of my head, because you can see how granular and specific they can all get as well. It's not just a simple question of how do I act with more integrity? It's a much wider issue than that. But that's only obvious when you run it through the 4-quadrant framework. It actually becomes quite difficult to not make a change when you use something like this because it is so specific. So just think about a value or a trait or a characteristic that you might like to start practicing and just see how it all fits in. So 4 good little starting points for this might be freedom, authenticity, curiosity, and creativity. So if you wanted to give this a go, maybe start with any of those 4. And again, just run it through the model. And then finally, we can use this framework to begin tackling bigger life questions as well. Now, I'm not going to go over comprehensively each of these quadrants again because it'll just get far too repetitive. But just notice how we might ask a question like, why do I keep making the same mistakes? So it can be useful to see where we've been placing just all of our attention and which quadrants we've been completely ignoring. So we might be so focused on our actual habits and patterns in the upper right, when actually it would be more useful to be introspecting a little bit and seeing what we're doing to ourselves on an unconscious level, which would be more like the upper left section. It might lead us into this really fascinating world and confronting world of shadow work, which can give us really, really juicy questions then. If we're going to think about really granular, specific ones, it might be things like, what do I secretly enjoy about making these same mistakes over and over again? And at first, that might seem like a really ridiculous question, but actually, deep down, it gives us a lot of comfort knowing that we can at least predict what our problems might be and how we're going to react to them. So rather than facing genuine uncertainty where things could improve, which would then bring about potentially new responsibilities and new problems at the same time, maybe we've fallen into the habit of actually enjoying complaining about our problems. Now, that's just a hypothetical example, but it does show the depths that we can potentially reach if you place the focus on a quadrant that you might otherwise overlook. So that started over here. And actually, all those questions would have come from over here, something we could have easily just, like I say, overlooked. So you can analyze your behavior all you like, but the confronting realization in the upper left is, I like repeating the same mistakes because it means I get to avoid responsibility and live in my comfort zone for longer in the short term. And that could be way more enlightening, and it could prompt a much, much bigger change. So just a couple more questions, bigger life questions that you might consider with all of this just in mind. I'll give you just 4 of them. So what does it mean to live the good life? Number 2, what does it mean to be successful? Number 3, just to link onto a previous video I've already made, why am I ignoring who I need to become? And the last one, what would it mean for me to be living a purposeful life, and what would this look like in each of the 4 quadrants? Now, as you can probably see already, this is an absolute rabbit hole jumping into integral theory and just Ken Wilber in general. And I've read quite a few of his books by now, and some of them are very challenging reads for someone who is just trying to get used to this world of thinking. So I'm just going to give you 3 book recommendations in no particular order for this. So firstly, there is The Eye of Spirit. I quoted this in the previous section of the lesson. So on the back, it asks a really good question, which is just this one up here. Hopefully it'll turn up clearly. What would a truly integral culture look like? A culture that included body, mind, soul, and spirit. And this book just explores that question in a very thorough, but a very approachable way. At least by Ken Wilber's standards, at least. And we've also got this other lovely book, which is A Brief History of Everything. So it's quite a fun read, this one. It's stylized as a question and answer book. So it's basically Ken Wilber acting as an interviewer to himself. And it is actually surprisingly quite funny in places as well. Out of all the books I've read of his, this one is probably the most accessible. And it's a good beginner level introduction to a few of his bigger ideas as well. But if you would just like a simple, short overview of the majority of his key ideas across all of his books, then the essential Ken Wilber will probably be more practical, probably be a best starting point in that case. So this book is just excerpts and quotes from his other works, and most chapters are very, very short. They're 5 or 6 pages, and they just give a quick little overview of a particular idea. And then they flow into the next chapter, which is a similar idea, and then yeah, it basically just all flows from those. It's a really, really good book. It is spiritually worded at times and very philosophical and technical at others. So there is a good chance that if you don't like one part of it, then you will like another. And I'm trying to avoid recommending some of his other books that are 700 pages or longer because they're just going to be an absolute slog for you to get through if you realise 50 pages in that you don't particularly like his ideas or his writing style or anything else like that. So we've covered the theory. We've looked at how to apply it, but now you've got to actually go out and do something about it. So if you're new to this world, then you might not believe it, but I've actually given a very simplified overview of this idea, and it goes far, far deeper. So going forward, try applying this to your life. You might focus in the beginning on a particular problem or an issue. It might be how to embody specific traits or characteristics, or it might be how to tackle a bigger life question. But this is a wonderful little toolkit that just gets much easier to use the more that you actually practice it. And I'd love to know how you get on as well if you do decide to use this. And as I say, I've got those 3 wonderful books for you to help you take it further if you wanted to. And that is the model. That's how you apply it. So I will see you in a future lesson.